Welcome, everyone. This is going to be the Caregivers Panel, and we're going to wait a few minutes to let people trickle into the room. Welcome, everybody, to the Caregivers Panel. I'm hoping if you can fill in this poll for us really quick, just to kind of give us an idea of who is attending. That would be really helpful. And we are excited to share our stories with you today. So to get started, my name is Rachel Vogel, and I will be moderating this session. I'm a cancer researcher here at the University of Minnesota. I'm an assistant professor in the Division of Gynecologic Oncology, and I also am a cancer caregiver. I took care of my little brother, Phil, when he was diagnosed with a glioblastoma 10 years ago this month, but it feels like yesterday still. And so my hope in really this panel is that we will talk about everything caregiving. I hope that you will send us your questions, anything that you're struggling with, anything that we can share our experience. I'm hoping that will be really helpful for you. This quote from Rosalind Carter I think is really important. There are only 4 kinds of people in this world: those who have been caregivers, those who are currently caregivers, those who will be caregivers, or those who need caregivers. And so really this is something that is important for all of us. And so I'd like to introduce the panel that we have today. We have Rachel Engstrom, Eleanor Leary, and Kyle Woody. And would each of you introduce yourselves? And Kyle, you're first on my screen if you want to get started.
Hi, everyone. I'm Kyle Woody. I am the founder and executive director of Jack's Caregiver Coalition. Our vision is a world where guy caregivers never feel alone, and our mission is to improve the way that guys think, feel, and act through every phase of their caregiving journey.
And Rachel, you're next on my screen.
I'm Rachel Engstrom. I am a former cancer wife, then widow, and now advocate. I'm an author and a cancer health educator.
And Eleanor.
Good morning. I'm Eleanor Leary. I'm one of the clinical social workers with the Adult Blood and Marrow Transplant Program at the University of Minnesota.
Excellent, thank you. And before we get started, I need to read these set of ground rules and disclosures, so bear with me. So the goal of the session is to help those in attendance feel better, more hopeful, and not alone. We are not going to talk about specific diagnoses or treatments or give medical advice. And we're also not going to discuss specific side effect management or how to deal with practical problems such as work or childcare or how to navigate the medical system. And so with that, I do want to welcome your questions again. So you can use the Q&A feature to enter your questions, and I will be watching those and bring them up with the panelists as I can. But before we begin our panel discussion, Rachel is going to get us started with the presentation. So thank you, Rachel.
Thank you. Good morning. I feel so privileged to be here. When I was a new cancer wife at 28 in 2011, I felt lost and I stumbled upon this conference. And after attending, I just felt so empowered about nutrition and caregiving and all these things. So it's kind of a 180 to be here now on the other side of all of it and advocate and learn so much from all of you. An article I wrote from a caregiver website I'm going to read. Braving the Caregiver Storm. Dear fellow caregiver, I've worn similar shoes to those you're finding yourself in. I've been tired. I felt confused. I felt alone and isolated. I felt so overwhelmed, like if one more thing was added to my plate, I might explode. But I am here to tell you that caring for my late husband when he had cancer was one of the greatest honors of my life, one of my proudest accomplishments to date, and something I wouldn't change for the world. Having your life thrown upside down when your loved one becomes ill is something you cannot prepare for. Just like an unpredictable storm coming into your neighborhood, caring for a loved one can bring so many unknowns, questions, and at times fear and sadness. I find myself switching from being a relatively carefree young wife who worked full-time and had a myriad of other side projects to having to shelf all that to be a cancer wife. I was attempting to balance my personal life with being a new caregiver. I was tired, stressed, and my future with my husband, the man who had been my world since I was 19, was a big question mark. It wasn't until I spent hours online looking for resources that I began to realize I really wasn't the only one lost in this crazy journey called caregiving. Within the first 2 weeks of Grayson's diagnosis, I created a Caring Bridge blog and a Facebook group to update our supporters on his health journey, and was receiving kind messages of support that made me feel less isolated. Back then, there weren't these amazing virtual and social media support groups where you could connect with other caregivers online. So I made sure that I had a couple people in my corner to support me when I needed it most. I knew that my husband was going through so much himself, so I turned to these confidants to express my fear and doubts, but more importantly, to share the little triumphs and miracles we experienced along the way. Later on, I started seeing a therapist to help me process my feelings and ended up learning ways to cope and reshape the circumstances I found myself in. By having an outside source to talk to, I was able to leave each appointment with a literal spring in my step at times. I remember skipping to my car, feeling refreshed and ready to go back to caring for Grayson. I learned how important it was to surround myself with positivity, whether that be people, music, movies, TV, or social media. My wires were pretty frayed most days, and I quickly learned that I felt more charged and refreshed when I surrounded myself with people who lifted me up, not brought me down. I turned to music that made me smile, comedic movies and sitcoms, and for the most part, avoided comparing myself to other people's perfect looking lives on social media. I didn't always excel at doing all these things, but I sure did try. I had friends meet me at the hospital for a cup of tea or to go for a walk. When Grayson was in remission and doing better, I went for a concert every now and then. I even went on a couple weekend-long silent retreats. Carving time out for myself didn't come easy or even seem natural at times, but I knew if I didn't do those things for myself, my mental and physical health would suffer, and I couldn't do all I needed to do for my husband. There were times when I felt guilty, but I had to let that go. He had a wonderful healthcare staff taking care of him, and a friend or family member at home if need be. Respite care agencies can offer breaks too if you need help and you do not have a support system. My late husband has been gone 9 years now, but I still smile every time I think of him. As a caregiver, I learned so much about myself, those around me, and what it truly means to live and love. I hope my reflections have brought you a bit of light in the storm you may find yourself in. As far as some tips I have for self-care to avoid burnout, even though we all kind of do reach that burnout wall sometimes, I think those support groups, therapy is, all those types of things are important. I found having a therapist, having this third party that's on the outside that doesn't know that they're your person. They only know what you're telling them. You're not the cancer spouse. You're not the caregiver. It's what you want to talk about, where you are in life now, how you want to talk about those things. They don't have any judgments or know those types of things, and they can help with coping skills. Having a friend or family to confide in, and things you don't want to share with your loved one. I knew there was so much going on that he had in his head. I used to say, this is your own personal Afghanistan. I can't imagine what it's like. I personally didn't want to let him know all those doubts, all those feelings, all those types of things. We did have conversations and share things, but I think it's important to have that outside perspective to talk to. And I didn't have, at the time, I didn't know of Gilda's Club or Jack's Caregiver Coalition or those types of things that are there for support. And it's very exciting that there are those things available now. As far as social support, people want to help. They really do. They want to fix you. They want to fix the situation. They want to make things better. And when they can't, what's really wonderful is it is really hard to ask for help sometimes. But I like to say, utilize those skills that people have, because if they can make brownies for the nurses, if they can cut your grass, if they can shovel your driveway, if they can do those types of things that take time, take energy that you don't have, they feel like they can give something back in a way and make things better for you when they can't tangibly take away the illness, take away those things. So if you can, get up the bravado to be able to do that, to ask those things. I think that you'll find a lot of people really do want to help, whether it's putting a social media post up, hey, I'm so tired, does anybody know anybody that can help with that? A lot of people really, I think you will find in your corner, maybe even people you haven't talked to in years, that would be thrilled to be able to help, because that's a tangible way they can help. I think that things that you can ask for, gas cards, grocery cards, things like that. People don't understand the expenses of parking. I remember getting a parking pass, a monthly parking pass. My husband was treated at the U here. Things like that. It's $60 every month, or it was back then. It's, those types of things, all those things add up. So if you can say, hey, especially right now, hey, would anybody be willing to donate some gas cards? That'd be great. If people are asking what they need, give them tangible ideas of things that you actually need. And it might take a while to, think of those things and draft those ideas. Also, take that time for a walk. Have someone meet you at the clinic. Have someone, if they're like, hey, can you go for dinner? If you're like, no, I can't, but I'm at the clinic all day. Do you want to come sit with me while I'm waiting for them in chemo or radiation or whatever that is? Have them meet you where you are at, bring you a cup of coffee, do those kinds of things, go for a walk around the block at the health facility where they are. Those types of things are really powerful. And I think just being able to get out even for 20 minutes, it's a breath of fresh air. It's those types of things. So if you'd like to connect with me, I did write Wife Widow Now What, How I Navigated the World of Cancer and How You Can Too. It's my social media post in real time as I'm navigating insurance and disability and employment and mental health and all these things. I'm telling you my love story, but this toolbox of these things that worked for me. I know every situation is very different, but I hope that can offer some guidance to people, especially finances, those things people really don't think about, all those things I go through. And I also have like over 50 podcasts on Apple and Spotify and YouTube and things like that, I think the fact that I can go from being in your shoes where you're at to being this like gusto and advocate, and my husband is not here anymore. However, all those gifts and things that I've learned, I'm a very positive person and I'm just fired up to help all of you. So if you want to connect, you can find me on Instagram and Facebook at Wife Widow Now What. And, caregiving is not always the most pleasant thing. It's not always a favorable thing. Especially when your person's on steroids or, those types of things. Those days are not easy, but it's certainly a blessing to be able to take care of someone and hope that when it's our turn to be taken care of, we will have that adequate care as well. So I just want to cheer you all on. You are doing it. You are all superheroes. And I really thank you for allowing me to be here today.
Thank you, Rachel. And I will second, pretty much everything you said. Very similar experiences and thoughts that I have. So for the remainder of this session, we're going to tell stories and share our experiences with you, and also just answer as many questions as we can. And so, one thing, it's been said that cancer is a family disease, right? And it affects the entire family, not just the patient. And so I'm asking, what does that bring to mind for you? And Eleanor, I thought I would start with you from your perspective. Oh, muted again. We were also kind to mute while Rachel was talking.
Yes, thank you. It's everyone has a different situation, of course, right? So everyone's family looks different. Some people live far away, some people live close. It can create additional stress for those family members who do live away because they're not here to help with sort of those practical things like, I'm going to drive you to radiation every Wednesday. So some of the process is just sort of managing those expectations as well. For some folks, their family is made up mostly of people who aren't related by blood, so friends. And it can be difficult to manage both your own, as the caregiver, my own feelings, thoughts about this cancer diagnosis, what that means now, what that means for the future. It's hard to manage everyone else's emotions, because they'll call and they'll say, I'm so very sorry, and express sadness, or whatever it is that they're feeling. And holding space for all of that is exhausting. So it's finding a way to both manage your own feelings, being there for your person, the person who's ill, but then allowing space for all of these other emotions that other folks are feeling as well. Um, and it's exhausting. It's exhausting. So self-care, very important, as Rachel pointed out. There are many ways that that can be done. It takes practice. It's not something that, of course, we all necessarily excel at. And when you have all of these demands on your time, it's hard to prioritize self-care anywhere near the top of that list. But in my experience with folks, I've made arrangements to have um, coffee with my friend Clara every Wednesday, and I know that George is going to drive my person to their appointment. So it's both giving yourself permission to do that, but then also following through. Because when you're in the trenches, powering through, doing this important work, it's easy to set aside those things when you feel like there's something that's more important. I would argue that it's equally as important, but it's easy to set those aside.
I'll pitch it to you too. What do you think, when you hear cancer as a family disease?
It's absolutely true. We took to just a simple pronoun change, that we have cancer. And Sarah, my wife, was diagnosed with colon cancer at the age of 33. And for her, her treatment would be infusion, coming home and having a machine that would continue to infuse her for several days. And for the better part of a week, she was more or less in a coma. And, one day, she helped me understand that, throughout that time, she was mostly sleeping. And so mostly she wasn't experiencing the treatment, right? But I was very much present and witnessing her getting out of bed and seeing her from behind without a shirt on, and I could see her rib cage from behind. These are traumatic things that we see, and they change us. And so anyone who suggests that as a caregiver they don't have cancer, I think they need to think harder and strive to appreciate what it is that they're doing, and open themselves up to these things. This psychological suffering that we all experience, it changes us. And so if we can open ourselves up to that and ask ourselves, what does that mean, and how can I show up better? And I think oftentimes, as we've heard from everyone on this panel, what that means is we need support too, and we need to find community, and we need to find places to open up and talk about these things.
I thank you for your honesty and saying the word trauma. So I'll get vulnerable here too. I think that that was something I didn't expect. I didn't expect the trauma that I would experience. My brother was treated here at the U, and I still to this day avoid the hospital. I spent many days and nights at that hospital with him, and I can't step foot in there without the memories just flooding back. And that trauma will come back at times you're not expecting. And, but it's really, it's interesting to me. Some of the memories that I have are they're just burnt in. And I remember, after I lost my brother, meeting with a grief counselor, and I was like, when are the good memories going to come back? I was so afraid that all of those hospital visits, all those things that were just burned in my brain would be all I would be left with, and that I wouldn't remember the good times. And I will say that it took a while, but that has changed. So over time, some of those memories are still very strong, but they have been replaced. And the good memories do kind of fill back in. But I really, be cognizant of that. I think that a cancer diagnosis really can be experienced as a trauma, and the way that you deal with it and process it, really varies person to person. But I think probably one of the most surprising things to me was that experience of trauma. And so I guess, we've all kind of hit on this. I think everybody has said something about how to manage that distress. So as a researcher, there's a lot of work that's shown that actually the caregivers experience as much distress as the patients themselves, the loved one themselves. And so, I think we've kind of touched on this, but what are some concrete things that you've done to manage the emotions, manage that stress? And was there a point where you just realized, like, I really need help? And so, Rachel, how about I'll start with you?
Yeah, I want to address that, but I also want to loop in before I forget. One thing I think we experience as caregivers with the family system is the disappointment when you think people will be there and they're not.
Mm-hmm.
I think that is huge. So my husband, his dad died when he was 16. His mom was very narcissistic. At one point when he had to like go on an event, she was like, well, I have something at church first, so I need to go do that first, and then I'll come. And it was like coming like 3 or 4 hours later and things like that, where you're just like, why aren't you here? And I think that what's really difficult is we have to figure out within this trauma, how do we restructure our support? How do we do those things? And part of our self-care is restructuring the people in our lives. It's, okay, I really can't depend on these people. I'm from Michigan, so my parents came and took shifts of the 18 months, of the 23 months my husband was sick, 18 months, they took shifts on and off living with us. And I remember being like 28, like, oh my gosh, I don't want my mom and dad to live with me. But it turned out, he needed people to take him to appointments and do things like that. But that came in when we couldn't count on my husband's mom. And, reaching out to a friend's mom that I knew to take him to an appointment or different things like that. And I think the best way we can care for ourselves is to put that blanket, I need help, out there. And it's interesting because there are so many people I'm running into these days where they're wanting support, but the actual patient doesn't want people to know they're sick, doesn't want people to know these things, but you're like, but I need the support, I need the help. So I think it's really powerful that we recommend to the patient that they try to have counseling as well. And then that's something they can address. But I think that part of caring for ourselves is coming to that other collateral trauma and loss that those we thought were there for us might not be. And how do we change that dialogue to say, oh, I know this is a really good friend, or more of an acquaintance. Let's see if we can rope them in to become our new support network. I had sisters so my family's all over the country. They're not family here. I remember they would send my husband like unlimited goldfish crackers and silly shirts and pajama pants. And he was the guy in the hospital that always had like the Kool-Aid man or the, Muppets straight from the 70s. And that was what he talked to the nurses about and things like that. And I feel like them even being able to send care packages, I didn't have to worry about after working 8 hours and going to the hospital, needing to pump him up because he'd had this other support. So I think even saying, hey, can you text? Can you check in? Can you do those types of things? That's caring for you because they're doing that caring. So I think ideas of reaching out those types of ways with those, will be accountable. And I think what's really hard to wrap our minds around, but I can look at this with years of hindsight, is those that we ask for help, more than likely we're going to help them at some point later too. And it is really more reciprocal than we will ever think.
To Rachel's point, I think also a resource that you can call upon are the staff at the treatment center, because I have had countless conversations with folks in that exact situation that Rachel highlighted of, as the patient, I don't want people, I mean, because as individuals, we have varying levels of how vulnerable, how much we want to share with other people, how private we are. And in a relationship, whether that be a romantic relationship or a sibling relationship, there are going to be differences in the levels of what we want to share. And so I've had countless conversations with folks about that very dilemma. The patient may not want the support, may not feel it's important to them, and they rely solely on the caregiver for the support. But the caregiver wants to be able to tell other people, wants to be able to reach out. And so it's talking about that situation and working through, everyone's thoughts and feelings about it, and perhaps coming to a compromise where some information can be shared to provide a vehicle for the caregiver to get support, but the patient doesn't feel like they're having to be very vulnerable or share private information that they wouldn't want to share. So that's another resource folks can call upon.
I like that. Kyle, anything you want to add?
Yeah, I would pile on with Eleanor there and say, in a nutshell, be courageous. And when I say courageous, when I talk about courage, I think the more important courage is not the heroic kind. It's the less flashy, ordinary kind of courage. And I think it's more important because we have the opportunity to practice that every day. The kind that requires us to speak openly and honestly about how we're feeling and about who we are deep down inside. And I think if you can bring that to whoever you engage with, you're going to find people who are going to be willing to help, to join your team and show up for you however you need them to. But it starts with the courage. And if I, for far too long, had this machismo guard up where, I was trying to help everyone else all the time and make them the thing that needed support. And so what I was doing was trying to be the magic in every situation. And it took me way too long to figure out I needed to let other people be the magic. And it took a lot of courage. And I'm proud of myself that I was able to finally get there. But I certainly see the potential for everyone in this audience to not waste as much time as I did.
So, I think along those lines, Kyle, maybe you can talk about, Jack's Coalition, just, what resources, and I think that's what you're doing now. You're providing the resources you didn't know about then. What resources do you wish you would have known about a lot earlier?
Yeah, I think that, just that there are so many people out there ready and willing to help. And, at the time, of course, during my journey, Jack's Caregiver Coalition didn't exist. Where I lived, there were very little resources or focused conversation around caregiving at all. But even if there had been, I wouldn't have probably known about it. Specifically, what we offer is a community of support. We've served hundreds of caregivers and shown up for them thousands of times because of people like Rachel Engstrom on this panel who volunteer for us, and they love showing up for caregivers. They absolutely love it, and you can see it in their faces at the gatherings. So sometimes it's a one-on-one, sometimes it's a group, sometimes it's a conference like this, but we believe what caregivers need is community, and telling them over and over to take care of themselves, it's true, but we also need to be taken care of, right? When do caregivers get to just be taken care of? And it's not often enough. And so that's what we're here to do. And so we do the best we can to show up for you however you need us to. And of course, our resources are not limitless. We for example, we don't provide financial support or grants, but we know a lot of places that do, and we'll point you in those directions. We just want to show up for caregivers and provide them community. And I could go on. I could go on about all the things, driving tanks and all the crazy work. We kind of have a crazy, reputation for doing some pretty silly things, but they're all pointed in that direction.
So 2 nights ago, I hosted the in-person clash for Jack's at Common Roots Cafe and ordered a bunch of food. People sat around and they just talked. You have that hour. And I totally understand that, it's tough to leave your person and those types of things, but that is so, so important. I wanted to speak to someone asked the question, how do you find resources if there's not really a caregiver in the picture? People like Eleanor, the hospitals, clinics, things like that, I would check in with where they're being treated, ask for what resources are available. People can do those types of assessments, see what's available. Many health insurance policies include transportation to appointments and things like that, because we all know it's really hard to balance. I was, like I said, 28 when my husband got sick. All of a sudden you're on one income and you still have the house payment. You still have all these things. They don't, death and taxes, like people say, those things don't stop. And I think the statistic, at least of last year, was there's like 16,400 is the average non-insured expenses out of pocket a year for cancer that the average patient has. So I have tons of resources in my book on finances and where to find these types of things. But I think that, the American Cancer Society, if you've never checked it out, they have a transportation program, people that are volunteers that will help you get to appointments and things like that. But I think the best step would be to start to see an assessment at the clinic, at the hospital, what they can do, come in, look at those types of things to see what programs are available. I remember after my husband had his 5 intensive weeks, the induction phase of his hospitalization, chemo and all that at the U, waiting to pick up this giant shopping bag of pills at the pharmacy in the Fairview Hospital. And there was a man, I was sitting in a bench waiting, and there was a man talking to the pharmacist, skinny, bald, clearly had cancer. He just finished his treatment. He had his duffel bag and he was going home, and they said, "Who's your caregiver?" And he said, "I don't have one." And I just remember being blown away and thinking, oh my gosh, what would that be like? But what's amazing now compared to back then in 2011 is there are caregiver organizations like Jack's, there are magazines, there are all these types of things where not only can they provide you with support, but just letting someone know. And what's really tricky about being in the cancer community is when you have your person have cancer, you're going to know more and more people that have cancer or that are caring for cancer. So if you can spread the word of those resources and say, even a Facebook post or what that is, do you know anybody that needs a caregiver? Check out these resources, have them get an assessment. But Eleanor can speak more to that, but there are the abilities to have, assessments, waivers, all these types of things to provide that if you don't have that social support.
I think that leads to my next question, Eleanor. What tips do you have for caregivers on how to best interact with the healthcare system and the healthcare team?
It's really important to have conversation with the person that you're caregiving for, to understand what amount of information they want you to have. Now, if it's a partner relationship, if it's a sibling, if it's a friend, patients have different levels of desire to have, to share information. So important to have that first conversation. I think also important to fill out any paperwork that would allow the professionals at the treatment center to be able to discuss protected health information with someone other than the patient. Now, if you are the caregiver and you're always with the patient, then you're hearing things that happen in an appointment, in an infusion area, in the hospital. But if the caregiver wanted to call the nurse's station and ask a question, and that documentation isn't on file, then there can be a roadblock, there can be a barrier. So just getting that out of the way right up front. I know that in BMT, we send that paperwork out on the first visit they ever have with us. So they can fill it out. The patient can think about who they would want to be on that list, because it can be more than one person. And then that is taken care of. For some folks, having a notebook. I write down a question that I think of at Wednesday at 2 a.m. that I'm never going to remember Friday at the appointment. And I then write the answer. This is also helpful if you have multiple caregivers going to multiple appointments, because it offers a way to communicate to all the other caregivers. And quite frankly, if I'm the caregiver who wrote it down, I may forget. It's a lot of information coming at you at one time, right? And so having the ability to write it down and be able to refer back to it, but then also others can refer to it and say, okay, I'm even in the hospital. I've had patients who've had different caregivers there every day, and then the doctor comes in, they have rounds, and the caregiver writes it down. So then when, let's call the primary caregiver, which may be a spouse or a sibling, comes in, the person who is sort of the one go-to, they can't be there all the time. And so this other person has written down these answers, and then as, let's say that's me, I'm the primary caregiver, and I say, oh, okay, well, that's good to know, because I was wondering about that myself. I think what Kyle hit on, the word he used is so resonated with me, is the courage to be able to say, to ask hard questions and to say, this is something that I need to know. I'm the advocate for my person when they aren't able to be an advocate. They either have horrible nausea and they have medication that, while helps with the nausea, also makes them sleep. So, there's just so many situations that I'm sure that all three of you could think of in your minds about being a caregiver and being in that advocate role, which, I mean, to be honest, puts another level of stress on the caregiver, right? So in addition to helping with the food and the transportation and the laundry, you're also the person who has to say, when your person can't, wait a minute, what does that mean? Should we be doing that? So it's, there's that. The other vehicle is to have a healthcare directive. And that is a form that gives permission to a person or people, to make medical decisions for the patient when they're not able to, because of course they're the person who is the decider when they're able to. Those would be just a few ideas. I mean, I'm sure there's a lot more, but I don't want to take up all the time. So.
Well, I like that. And I like what you said about being an advocate. You're right that at times that was stressful, but for me, it was actually probably the proudest part for me, was being able to advocate, knowing that that was a place where I was really making a difference. And so Rachel and Kyle, I want to kind of pitch it back to you. I want to hear about positive experiences. I want to hear about a silver lining. I want to hear about, something that, now looking back, you're really thankful for about the experience.
I wanted to say too, having power of attorney is important for all those types of things. I remember wanting to cancel cable and I couldn't. Just all those financial things they don't think of while they're in treatment and too tired. That's important. For me, just the ecosystem of the clinic, the nurses, the hospital, all those things. I remember after my husband died, being like, oh, oh, I don't have all those people, because I like them
Mhm.
so much. They're your
Mhm.
cheerleaders. Like even the person that would come in the hospital and like take out the trash and sweep, or the person that, was the checker in the cafeteria and all those things. I think that's something no one really talks about is, you have the doctors, which are the experts, but it's the nurses that are, wiping the butt of your person when they're too ill to do it, or helping them brush their teeth. They're doing all those things. And I think that, the silver lining is these incredible people that come into your life and feel like family, and you're not prepared for how much they're just going to envelope you with that support and truly, truly be there for your person because they went to school for it. They want to care and love for your person when you can't be there. And I think that that provides such peace as a caregiver to know that your person is so well taken care of while you're at work, or when they're getting that blood tested, that person has that sense of humor with your person and all that kind of stuff. I think that it's truly incredible and such a gift to feel like you're getting these just virtual hugs and warm fuzzy feelings by this community of people.
Yeah, I would add, I was inspired by the words of Allison Applebaum. She's the founding director of the Caregivers Clinic at Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center. She said, for all caregivers, the challenges endemic to caregiving have the potential to eventually serve as learning and growing experiences that can help them live more full, authentic lives, both during caregiving and after.
Mhm.
And I could not agree more with Allison. And what excites me most about her statement is during caregiving. I'm, back to your question, Rachel, I'm most grateful. And the silver lining I see is that that's exactly what happened for me. I live a full and authentic life today because of what I experienced and what I was able to learn and grow from.
Mhm.
The other side of that coin is I had so much opportunity to do that during caregiving that I was unaware of. And so just being open to that opportunity for growth, and it'll happen regardless of how you navigate the journey. I believe you will learn and grow from it. You'll figure out who you are. You'll figure out who your values are. You'll figure out, what do you want the rest of your life to be about. Um, but yeah, that's what I'm grateful for. I have a lot of clarity around all of those things now, and I, were it not for caregiving, I'm not sure that I would.
That quote resonates for me too. I was in my first year graduate school getting my PhD when my brother was diagnosed, and it changed. I mean, what I would not do what I do now if it wasn't for that experience. I wouldn't be, I'm laser focused on improving quality of life for cancer survivors, and that's because of the countless conversations we had about he just wanted to live longer at any cost. And I was the one saying, but you can't eat anymore. You can't walk anymore. You can't, really having these tough conversations about quality of life. And that, I have no regrets about that. It absolutely, I like your word clarity. I think, it really changed the way that my future is because of that. I want to transition to, we have a little bit of time left, and I hope if anybody has any questions, please put them in the Q&A. One thing I think is really important in these tough situations is to find humor, to laugh. And Rachel, you mentioned, watching comedies and those things, but even trying to humor in, what otherwise doesn't seem like a very funny situation. So the example that I share this all the time. Early on, about in the first year of my brother's diagnosis, he had a stroke that resulted in a long ICU stay. And those of you who have ever been with somebody as they're coming out of the ICU have probably experienced, they're really irritable. They're usually confused. And my brother was hallucinating. And so my other brother and I were sitting with him as he was transitioning out of ICU. And he was so mad. he just kept on telling us, why did you put a pizza box on the end of my hospital table? Why is that there? What, can't you move it? I mean, he's just yelling. That pizza box did not exist. And he was just so mad. And so finally I just walked up, put my hands where he thought this pizza box was, picked it up, threw it in the trash can, I totally invisibly. And he just yelled at me, see, was that so hard? And my brother and I just laughed. I mean, we couldn't hold it in anymore. And we were just laughing and laughing. And we still talk about that. So I think finding those little pieces of humor are so important.
Mhm.
And I'm curious if either of you, any of you have something like that, that you can think of, a story like that.
Tons of them. I can just Sarah towards the ends of her life in hospice. She couldn't walk. She couldn't go to the bathroom. She was bedridden primarily, and I was checking in on her, multiple times an hour, and a very independent woman. And so at one point I said, do you need anything? And she said to me, what I don't need is a babysitter. And I wasn't the only one to get that very stern message from her. And all we could do was laugh about it, right? Like I don't even remember exactly what I did in the moment, but probably argued with her. But that didn't matter. There are so many situations we find ourselves in where that's the only answer, I think, is to laugh.
Oh, somehow you got muted. Rachel or Eleanor, either one of you have a story.
Yeah, so I always used to say, I don't know like at a particular point, I think he was having his first bone marrow biopsy in the hospital, and it was like, I mean, I think it was God for me, but it was like, I just turned into being super funny in that particular purpose. Like, and every time he had to be hospitalized, I'd always go, you had to be fancy. Was I not giving you enough attention at home? Like these types of things, because it's every time there's a fever and you have to go in and these types of things, it's such a collateral, like, oh, not again. So I would be like, well, I guess what I was doing at home wasn't good enough. So, just whatever little spin you can add to try to take the weight off of that moment, I think is really important. Or, we all have these collateral things, whether it be, you have a horrible day at work and then you step in a puddle on the way to the clinic or the hospital or on the way home. And then you get there and your person's not very nice. And you're like, well, this is an amazing day. However you can frame it and do those types of things are really important for your mental health.
So transition a little bit, but I think that this is really important, is to talk about relationship dynamics. And we talked a little bit about family, but I think, particularly for, Kyle and Rachel, your partners were the ones that were sick. And so, Kyle, I think, can you talk about the changes in your relationship dynamics and what that looked like?
Yeah, Sarah and I were exploring very, very, carefully before her diagnosis, getting divorced. And that was completely forgotten about and not even brought up for 5 years, during her journey with cancer. And during that 5th year, she brought it up and said, this is where we were headed. At what point do we resurrect that and finish that trajectory that we were on? And basically she dumped me. And that, I think, it's not a cautionary tale. I don't think it's just the fact that cancer blows up everything, and it becomes the central focus, to a fault. and there are casualties, and you know, we would, I don't think, have been married as long as we were it not for the diagnosis. I'll never know. But we just didn't have time to think or talk about us and what's really going on with us, or we had the time, but we just never took the time. So I, and certainly every single person, every single journey, every couple comes into this in a completely unique way and has completely unique needs. And my story is not the story, but I certainly know for a lot of caregivers, they need to find space to talk, maybe talk about these things out loud, the concerns they're having, the com the compassion maybe that they don't feel from their spouse anymore. Sarah, she didn't have the energy to care for me as a husband anymore. She was solely focused on beating this disease. I mean, she practically became an oncologist, and um, so that happens to a lot of caregivers. We got to find, where do we talk about it out loud with someone else, a therapist, a support group, a community, and then bring it to our partner and say, hey, this, I've explored this and I want to talk more about it. I want to figure it out. I want to wrestle it to the ground because I want to have a better relationship with you. And I don't want to just be your caregiver. I also want to be your husband or your wife.
And Eleanor, I'm hoping you can kind of piggyback a little bit to that. You see a lot of families, with children, and even as people are, maybe coming off of treatment or moving into a state of remission, or what do those transitions look like?
It can be difficult. I mean, if you think about it, before a cancer diagnosis, you could be co-parenting, you could be, parenting your children together with your partner, and you may have different tasks that you do. I take them to soccer practice, you take them to, et cetera, et cetera. And the kids go, to you equally, or maybe not, for emotional support or help with homework or questions about, can I have a snack? When a person's ill, their focus becomes that they may become less available to kids because they're not feeling well, they're sleeping, they're at treatment, they're not home. It might be scary. Mom looks different, dad looks different. There's medical hair loss, there can be other things that happen. Then a person gets through treatment. One other issue is that before treatment, a person could be independent with what they need. They don't need help or getting reminded to take medication. They don't need help getting dressed. They don't need help with all of these things. And of course, the hope is to get back to a point where they don't need help with that again. And that's the goal of the patient, the medical team, the family, the caregiver. And when you get to that point, it can be difficult to make the transition. The kids now have learned to go to mom or dad for their questions. And it can provide stress on a relationship if the caregiver continues to ask questions such as, have you eaten? Did you take your medication? When before cancer, those wouldn't have been questions that they would have asked. So transitioning out of the role of caregiver and maybe more into the role of spouse. And we've had a lot of couples come to us with just wanting help figuring out how to make that transition, both for themselves and their relationship, but for their kids too. How do we have everybody, and it's a process, of course, it's not a light switch that's just flicked, but it's a process of keeping that open communication, continuing to have courage, like Kyle talked about, having these difficult conversations where you say, this is where I want to be. And to your point, Kyle, where your wife said she doesn't need a babysitter, that is something that we hear a lot is, I want to be more independent as the patient than you, the caregiver, are letting me be. So it's a push-pull throughout all of that process. So I think communication, talking about your feelings, and having courage.
And I want to.
I just want to add quickly, for me, the first 8.5 years of my 11.5 years with him, he worked nights. So this 2.5 years of his illness gave us time together. And that's what I hold on to all these years later. And I remember even saying something in front of him and his mom, like, this has been great all this time. And his mom's like, but he has cancer. And I'm like, but we're together. And I went into this very early on and kind of made a pact with him and said, we can't afford to fight because we're in this war together. And I understand not everyone has those dynamics and cannot do that. And everyone's situation is unique. But I think as you, the caregiver, reminding yourself, because statistics are awful with cancer, and we do know how awful cancer is. It's hard. This is awful. They're not treating me well sometimes. I need support for myself. But this time is a gift. And kind of working on reframing it that way, as difficult as it can be sometimes. I just want to share that little sprout of positivity, because despite how ugly a lot of it was, that was a gift of time that we were given. And whether it was hours of PTO I took from work to take him to an appointment or those types of things, that's a positive out of it too.
I love that. And I love ending on that note. I want to thank you all for your the conversations. And I think that, hopefully this was really helpful for those of you who are listening. And so with that, we'll conclude this session. Please enjoy the rest of the conference. And Eleanor, Kyle, and Rachel, thank you very much.
Thanks
Thank
for having me.
you. Bye.